Welcome, this is Jim, host of the Faith Influencer podcast, where we're going to dive into discussions on faith's role in everyday life, from navigating blended families to overcoming challenges. I'm a husband, a father, a Bible teacher, an advocate for applying faith to everyday life. So tune in as I share personal stories, valuable insights, and practical wisdom. I read a title in the bookstore the other day, and it was The Rulebook to Fighting Fair. I like the idea of the rulebook of having better communication. Let's not call it fighting fair. I really don't like the idea of fighting with your spouse, but better communicating. Yes, let's do that. And there's a rule book. We're going to talk about that today. Welcome, as always, to Faith Influencer Podcast. This is Jim Cunningham. We're building blended families, and I'll always argue that the foundation to the blended family is the marriage. So last podcast and this podcast, we're dealing with the idea of it began with mistrust, and now we're at the idea of communicating. Communicating is that one thing that enables us to overcome those feelings of mistrust. But there's a rule book to good communication. Some of it's going to surprise you today, and some of it you're violating, which is why you're fighting. I want to take you from fighting to communicating better, to controlling your anger, to not being so mad. But before I give you the rules in the rule book to better communicating with your spouse, I want to give you a couple of don'ts. As a matter of fact, one big don't. Here it is before we go to the rules. Don't think that you're communicating because you can raise your voice. That proves nothing. I literally talk to a group of guys in my circle who tell me that the way they communicate with their spouse is by yelling. That's what they do. He yells at her, she yells at him. That's how they communicate. I even hear them doing it because I hear them talking on the phone and they're yelling into the phone. And I'm thinking, what are you doing? There's nothing impressive about someone being able to yell. Blended families have enough to discuss without throwing in this volatile emotion called yelling. So, as a matter of fact, if you are that person who likes to yell and raise your voice, you just kill the intimacy in your relationship. Who can be close to that? No one. It has to be dealt with. Now, I'm going to do something I don't usually do. I want to give you a pet peeve. This is a pet peeve, and I want to direct it to the men. Now, it's not just the men. Women do it too. Wives do it too, but especially men. Here's what men do. They say, yeah, I have a temper, but it's just the way I am. I just have a bad temper. My dad had a bad temper. His dad had a bad temper. You know what that is? That's an excuse. That's an excuse of something that you've not overcome as a child. A bad temper is nothing else than being weak. If you have a bad temper and you say, I can't control it, do you know what you're saying to the world? You're saying to the world that I'm unstable in this area of my life. Why? Because I can't control this emotion, and I excuse it by just saying, it's been passed down through my family. No, it hasn't. You've chosen to operate with a bad temper. I can think of few things that destroy relationships more than someone in a relationship who yells and screams and has a bad temper. I want you to learn self-control. That's a quality that you must incorporate. Self-control. That's the truth. So quit hurting your family. Quit hurting your kids. Sometimes a child is afraid to go to their parent because their parent doesn't have self-control over their temper, over their voice, over yelling. And as a result, a child flinches at the idea of communicating with their parent because they don't know how their parent's going to react. That is going to disrupt your blended family, is going to disrupt your marriage. That's the don't. I feel better. I've gotten that off my chest. That's my pet peeve. So now let's go from the idea of yelling and arguing to more important ways to communicate better. I'm going to give you 4 of them. Here we go. Jot these down. Number 1, never bring up a topic of controversy or that has the possibility of being controversial or volatile at bedtime. That's just the number one rule. You can never have those discussions at bedtime. It makes sense. As a matter of fact, the Bible says in Ephesians 4:26, as the writer of the book of Ephesians, Paul, is explaining us some details to have a better life. He says one thing you have to incorporate is do not let the sun go down on your anger. That's what he says. Do not let the sun go down on your anger. Well, we know why. Here's the scenario. You come to your spouse and you say, I want to talk about this, and it's 9:00 at night, and you go to bed at 10 o'clock or 10:30, and you get into this discussion, and maybe your spouse, maybe they have their own view and it's not yours, and you try to prove yours. Your spouse tries to prove theirs, and you get into this discussion. This is why they named the book Fighting, the Rules to Fighting, because it leads to a fight. I'm trying to help us go to better communicating and not fighting. But you get into this discussion before night and you don't resolve it. You don't resolve it before you go to bed. Do you know why the Bible gave us this wisdom to not let the sun go down on your anger? You know why? Because here's what's going to happen to you. You're going to go to bed and it's unresolved. Oh, it's still going on. You just didn't resolve it with your spouse. It's going on while you sleep. It's going on in your subconscious. It's going to simmer now all night. It's going to be like taking this frustration and putting it in a crock pot and turning that crock pot on to simmer. And it's going to simmer all night long. And when you wake up, it's not resolved. It didn't go away. It's worse. It's now stuck in your subconscious mind. And even though you're not discussing it, and even though your spouse may be smiling, all of a sudden, you know what you're feeling? You're feeling withdrawn. You're feeling a lack of emotions towards your spouse. And you may not even know why, but I'm telling you why. If you go with something unresolved all night long, then that simmers. And when it simmers, guess what happens next? It turns into bitterness. It turns into bitterness. And there's a passage in scripture says you have to root out all bitterness, because then bitterness turns into unforgiveness. That's where bitterness always goes. It is the unwillingness to forgive. That's what bitterness is. So think about this. All of this bitterness, this unwillingness to forgive, now you're holding this against your spouse. It all started because you didn't know the number one rule in communicating. Don't get into a discussion about deep things, about controversial things before you go to bed. There you go. Rule number one. Rule number two, in discussing, implement the rule of timeout. You have to be able to call a timeout. I'm going to give you this scenario. Let's say, I'll just use me for an example. Let's say my wife worked from home today. I went to my office today and it was very stressful. Well, there's something going on that my wife needs to talk to me about. And maybe there's a little emotions tied to it. But I've been stressful. I've dealt with people. It's been stressful. I've dealt with people. I've gone through all of this at work, and I arrive home. And when I get home, my wife meets me at the door and says, we need to talk. Well, here's the rule of timeout. The rule of timeout says that you can say to your spouse, this is what I would say, baby, I want to talk, but give me an hour. Give me an hour to kind of wind down and unload all the things that went on at work. And let's see, it's 5:30. So let's say at 7 o'clock, we'll sit down and we'll have a discussion about this. And she says, absolutely. That's the rule of timeout. The rule of timeout is that you have to be able to say, now's not a good time. Now, I don't mean that you're going to try to put off and not have the conversation. I'm saying that you know yourself, and right now is not a good time for you to have this discussion. but you can't leave it at that. The rule of timeout says this. The rule of timeout says that you have to name the time that you are going to have the discussion. You got it? It's okay to say now's not a great time, but in an hour, in 2 hours, we will sit down and we will have this discussion. So that's the rule of timeout. So implement that rule. I think it will help you. Now, when you sit down and you begin having this discussion, here's rule number 3. Rule number 3 is one at a time, please. One at a time. Now, do you know what I mean by that before I tell you? One at a time means is that you can't talk over each other. How many of you have had a discussion, quote, with your spouse? Maybe it was a little heated. Maybe you're mad. Maybe you disagree. Maybe you can't get the other person to see your viewpoint, and you're just talking over each other. There are some who say they never complete a sentence without their spouse interrupting them. That's one at a time, please. One at a time, please, means that you cannot interrupt the other person while they're talking. That's all it means. It's not difficult to say it. It's difficult to do. I mean, if you literally have to do this, if you have to take a pen and a notepad because your spouse is saying something and you're just dying because you want to say something and you don't want to forget it, jot it down, but you cannot interrupt. One at a time, please means you're going to wait till it's your turn. It's just a rule. I know it sounds childish, but it's going to help build better communication, because if you're always interrupting, who wants that? That's not communicating. That's not even in the definition of communicating. Don't think you can interrupt and then say, we had a good talk. No, you didn't. So one at a time. Now, here's what I'm going to ask you to do. We're building better communication. Why? Because we're building stronger blended families, which means what? We have a strong marriage. Here's what I'm going to tell you to do. This is just one of the best things you can do when you're having a discussion with your spouse. Don't get hysterical. We talked about that at a previous point. Don't raise your voice. Don't get hysterical, and don't get historical. Don't drag up the past. Don't say all these things that happened before, the discussions you had before. Don't get hysterical. Don't get historical. That has no place in this discussion. But here's what you do. You restate what your spouse said. There's hardly anything better to develop good communication than this point. Restate what they said. Here's how you say it. You're waiting your turn. Your spouse is sharing a frustration. Your response when they finish is, what I hear you saying is, and then you restate it. But you know what you're going to discover? You're going to discover that that may not be what they meant at all. Had you not restated it and they were able to clarify it, you may have gone down this whole road and argument that wasn't even a part of their thinking. So when you wait your turn and then it's your turn, what I hear you saying is you restate what they said. So wait your turn, restate it. That's rule number 3. And then rule number 4. Okay, here we go. Some of you are experts at this. Rule number 4 is tell the truth. Just tell the truth. Just tell the truth. Ephesians 5:25 says, speak the truth. It says, speak the truth. Just like Paul said, don't let the sun go down on your anger. He also says, in making a better life for us in our daily walk, is just tell the truth. Speak the truth. All kinds of things happen when we're not telling the truth. But here's what I want you to know. Your spouse may not tell you, but your spouse can always sense a partial truth. You just sense it. You can just tell there's a change in tone when it's a partial truth. I once took a course, a psychology course, when I was going through an undergraduate degree. And in the psychology course, we were listening to interviews that were detectives interviewing criminals. And it was fascinating, but in that interview, one of the things that you learned is how a detective tells if a criminal is lying. There were several things, but there was one in particular, and I'm going to spill the beans so that now you can watch your spouse. Now be careful, because you're going to see this all the time when maybe it's not happening, but I'm going to tell you what someone does when they're lying. Psychology says this. The detectives, this is a sign that they look for. They've all been trained to look for this. And it's really simple. It's this. When someone is lying, they tend to look up and to the left. That's what they often do. I don't know what's behind it. I just know that's one of the signs that someone is lying. They're talking to you and they do that. They just look up to the left while they're talking to you. That's a sign that they're not telling the truth. So there's a secret that we've revealed, all right? So a spouse can tell a partial truth. So if you don't tell the whole truth, let me tell you what's going to happen. It's going to end up coming back on you. I mean, the other half of that, you told the partial truth, but the other half of that is going to show up down the road. It is. I don't know why people think they're going to get by with telling partial truths, which, by the way, what kind of foundation for a marriage to have a strong blended family is it when you're telling partial truths? So when you tell a partial truth, your spouse is going to know it. Now they're going to watch for your little look up to the left to see if you're lying. And now it's going to show up sometime down the road. And you know what you've done? All of these things we've been talking about, these last two podcasts, this trust and mistrust, you've just damaged that whole trust thing again. And damaged trust is difficult to overcome. So don't even go there. Tell the truth, and they will learn to trust you. So there was this show that I used to watch. It was called The No Spin Zone. And the no spin zone means we're not going to spin the truth. We're not going to manipulate the truth. Now, some people do that. They'll spin the truth. It sounds like the truth, but they're spinning it and manipulating it so that it meets their objective or their needs. Sounds like politics, doesn't it? It sounds like spinning the truth to get my point across, to make it sound like I want it to sound. Well, people do that in marriage. They become political. They spin the truth. Don't spin the truth with your spouse. When you spin the truth, when you're spinning the truth, when you're not telling the truth or you're telling partial truths, you're just avoiding responsibility. That's what you're doing. We're going to teach our kids to be responsible while you avoid it. When we're not telling the whole truth, we're avoiding responsibility. As a matter of fact, in the Bible, the devil is called the father of lies. So if you get into this spinning the truth, which is really a lie, when you start telling partial truths, which is really a lie, you know where that comes from? So don't go there. Don't spin it. But here's what you do. There is a way to temper the truth. So sometimes you're like, oh, I'll tell her the truth, or I can't wait to tell him the truth. And you want to be harsh. And this is your justification for, quote, telling the truth, but you're going to tell it in a way that's going to hurt them. People do it. Oh yeah, people do it all the time. Spouses do it to each other. I'm just going to tell you the truth. And it's your way to get at your spouse. So when the Bible says, tell the truth, speak the truth, it knows as humans what we're going to do. It knows we're even going to tell the truth, but in a way we're going to hurt people with it. So this is how the Bible, the Apostle Paul says, speak the truth in love. Do you remember that? It's not just speak the truth, but speak the truth in love. So love always tempers the truth. Truth cannot be harsh or angry, or you're missing the whole point. So these are the rules. These are the rules. These are the rule book for better communication. Better communication is going to build a stronger marriage. A stronger marriage is going to be the example for your blended family. And that's our ultimate goal, blending families with truth and love with a strong marriage. So thank you for listening today. Let me encourage you to like, share, subscribe, be a part of what we're doing as we're trying to reach the world of blended families and build that strong foundation.